I definitely believe that the interests of the criminal is put before the victims in Canada.
Bulk discounts on murder in Canada. It's a concept that many Canadians find equally illogical and abhorrent, and yet it's now the central legal question facing Canada's highest court. But what exactly does this mean? How did we get here? And is it some sort of legal anomaly or part of a broader pattern in Canadian justice that puts criminals first while leaving victims and their families behind?
You have this culture where everybody is to blame except for the killer.
My name is Gunn, and this is Politics Explained. Murder in Canada, like anywhere, is not new, but the punishment for it has changed over time. Up until 1963, a conviction for murder in Canada carried with it the ultimate price: capital punishment. But it was at this point, under Liberal Prime Minister Lester Pearson, that things began to change. For 13 years, all death sentences in Canada were commuted to life in prison, and in 1976, under Pearson's successor, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a narrow vote in the House of Commons, 131 to 124, abolished capital punishment entirely. But this was only the beginning. Successive governments, the majority of them Liberal, continued to push for reductions in sentencing across the board, and more importantly, a fundamental change in how our justice system was designed to operate. Moving from one based on public safety, justice for victims, and individual accountability, to another focused on rehabilitation, release back into society, and collective guilt. And Canadians were starting to get fed up. This created a political opportunity for the first leader of Canada's new Conservative Party, Stephen Harper.
Make no mistake, a Conservative government is going to crack down on crime in this country.
Harper's stance on crime was simple. Rather than viewing criminals as just products of their environment, he viewed them as free-thinking adults capable of and responsible for their own individual choices. In his 2006 election platform, Harper promised a slew of criminal justice reforms, from mandatory minimum sentences for repeat offenders to ending house arrest for those convicted of crimes against children. But one of the most important promises made by Harper during the election was to close one of the most inexplicable loopholes in the Canadian justice system, highlighted most prominently by the case of Ontario serial killer Paul Bernardo. In the early 1990s, Bernardo was found guilty of 2 counts each of kidnapping, forcible confinement, aggravated sexual assault, and the first-degree murders of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. But to the horror of the victims' families, the resulting sentence was not what they expected. A fact explained to me by criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind just outside Toronto.
Back when he was convicted in the 90s, you could only get life in jail with no chance of parole for 25 years. But that's irrelevant or independent of how many people you killed. He killed 2 people. He got essentially a discount, you could use the term, for killing 2 people because he was allowed to apply for parole after 25 years. In other words, one of his victims' life didn't matter.
Bernardo was sentenced to life in prison. But in Canada, life does not mean life. Instead, life in prison means 25 years without parole. After your 25 years are up, you are eligible to be released back into society. This is the maximum sentence allowed in Canada. And incredibly, if you killed 1 person or 50 people, the sentence you received was identical. This is because Canadian law allowed people serving multiple life sentences to serve them at the same time.
I just have trouble trying to come up with a cogent moral argument that you should have no difference in your parole ineligibility whether you kill one person or you kill 12.
This is in direct contrast to other countries where mass murderers receive multiple consecutive sentences for each life that they take. For example, in New Zealand, the Christchurch mosque shooter received 52 life sentences and 480 years without parole, while Gary Ridgway, who murdered 71 women in the United States, received a life sentence for each of his prescribed victims, and had any possibility of future parole outright denied. In Canada, each of these killers would have received the same maximum sentence of just 25 years without parole. Harper recognized this practice of allowing criminals to serve multiple murder sentences concurrently as a serious flaw in the Canadian justice system and an affront to the inherent value of every victim's life. So in 2011, when Harper secured his first majority government, he saw his chance to change the law.
Of them all, there is no better example than our legislation to better protect the public from criminals, to reverse 4 decades of soft-on-crime justice policies. Well, we put much of this legislation together in one bill, as we promised in the campaign, and in the first 100 days, we passed it into law.
He came along and said, well, wait a minute. If we have a criminal code that says murder is the most serious charge in the code, but we have serial killers or people who kill 3, 4, 5, 6 people, why does each life killed not matter? Why can a killer apply for parole after 25 years no matter how many people he kills? So in 2011, the laws were changed essentially, and a judge could say, you took 2 lives, you're not able to apply for parole for 50 years.
Few details have been released about the dead and injured officers.
Perhaps the darkest day in the history of the RCMP in New Brunswick.
It's been a sad day here. There's been some tears and
as there's more information that comes available, we'll let you know. And our thoughts are with the families and with the community as well.
I can't talk.
In 2014, Harper's new law faced its first challenge when Justin Bourque went on a shooting spree in Moncton, New Brunswick, targeting members of the RCMP. 3 officers were killed and 2 badly wounded. With Harper's law in place, the judge was able to sentence Bourque to 75 years in prison without the possibility of parole, 25 years for each life taken. But it wouldn't be long before Harper's law would be needed again. In January 2017, 3 years after the Moncton murders, 27-year-old Alexander Bissonnette shot and killed 6 people inside a Quebec City mosque, an act of terrorism that reverberated across the country. When it came to trial, the judge presiding over the case used Harper's law to sentence Bissonnette to just 40 years without parole, 110 years less than the theoretical maximum, leading to disappointment and outrage among the surviving victims and many Canadians.
We were astonished and we were very upset after this sentence.
But if there was frustration with Bissonnette's original sentence, a year later, many would be utterly repulsed. In a shock, unanimous decision, the Quebec Court of Appeal ruled Bissonnette's sentence, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, reducing his guaranteed time behind bars from 40 to 25 years, meaning this mass murderer will now be eligible for parole by the time he turns 54. In doing so, the court also went on to declare Harper's law unconstitutional and invalid.
The Quebec Court of Appeal said, we're going to strike that law down. What the Court of Appeal said is very simple. It is cruel and unusual punishment for a killer, even a serial killer, to not be able to apply for parole in their natural life. They struck it down.
Why is that happening now? Is it how or who we're choosing as judges?
I think that's a part of it. I think it's the stretching of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We've seen the rise of human rights tribunals where all you have to do is allege some ism or some phobia and you automatically win. You automatically get a payout. You automatically get a decision in your favor. Anybody who says, look, some people do belong behind bars. Some people are so dangerous that this isn't a question of that mommy wasn't nice to them when they were younger. And by the way, the root causes of crime you can't talk about openly anymore.
And while some Canadians may comfort themselves by thinking that Canada's most high-profile and notorious killers are unlikely to ever be granted parole, the truth is, many of the perpetrators of this country's most heinous crimes have already been released, including child murderers like Harold Smeltzer and Wayne McBride.
So while yes, certainly there have been people that have committed so much trauma, ruined lives, driven other people to suicide, they can be released into the community, even though, again, people hearing that will say, wait a minute, are we letting people out who molested 25 young boys or young children? The answer is often yes.
Fortunately, in the case of Paul Bernardo, after serving 25 years in prison, he was denied parole on both his first and second attempts. But often overlooked is how the parole process itself, which can be initiated every 2 years, is a living nightmare for victims' families. And this can be it sounded like a pretty emotional experience going through this process.
These families, from Bernardo on down, are dragged through these hearings all the time, over and over. The pain is unbelievable. Not only is it emotional, but picture it. First of all, you tend to go to a small room in a penitentiary. Now, you're then going to be in a room with the person who might have killed or raped or beaten your loved one. And if you look again at the Bernardo hearing the other day, the family actually saw him on Zoom, looking right at them. You're looking into the eyes of the person who 30 years ago tortured and dismembered and sexually assaulted and encased your daughter in cement. That is something that anybody who hasn't been through it can never understand.
Since being declared unconstitutional by the Quebec Court of Appeal, Harper's Law heads next to the Supreme Court of Canada for its final judgment. Unfortunately, regardless of the outcome, this is not the only legal precedent in Canada that ignores the value of human life.
When I was getting out of the car to go to work, I heard on the radio that there was a fire on her street. And then I remember driving in the car over to her house thinking, like, you know, all these scenarios, like, oh, I'm gonna get there, she's gonna be sitting on the curb because her house caught on fire. So yeah, I got there and there were fire trucks and cops and all of that stuff. And yeah, and that's where the nightmare, I guess, you know, began.
In 2014, Cassandra Cake, the former partner of Jeff Durham and expected mother of their child, was brutally attacked and killed in her own home by 26-year-old Matthew Brush. Brush then tried to cover up his crime by mutilating her body and setting her house on fire. Despite the gruesome and horrifying nature of the killing, Brush received a so-called life sentence of just 22 years without parole, meaning he could be back on Canadian streets before he turns 49. Even worse, the fact that Cassie was 7 months pregnant with their preborn daughter didn't mean a thing.
They announced what they were going to charge him with, and of course it's a long list, and at the end of it, that list isn't so long anymore. It was pretty demoralizing when it came into focus that Molly, like our daughter, was going to be completely ignored. I didn't entirely understand the legalities of what all that meant, so I had to try to understand it, and ultimately what it came down to is just like, no, this is the most convenient way to do it, so this is the way Canadian law does it. And that's the thing, right? Like, that part isn't acknowledged. Her name, her, you know, the fact that Cassie had gathered all these clothes and prepared and had, you know, people were shopping for cribs and And it's preposterous that that could be ignored just for convenience.
But despite suffering such a traumatic and devastating loss, Jeff and Cassie's family were determined to keep the fight for justice alive.
Today, the father of that unborn baby visited the offices of local MPs accompanied by Kate's mother. They were delivering a petition. They want the law to change so it's a criminal offense to harm a fetus when the mother is harmed.
Jeff's activism spurred a nationwide petition, protests, and eventually a private member's bill in the House of Commons.
It was a bill brought forward by MP Kathy Wagenthal. She's from Saskatchewan, and it basically just would add a separate offense to the criminal code against killing a pregnant woman, knowing that she's pregnant and causing death to the child.
Where two lives full of hope and promise were horrifically ended, only one murder charge stands. Mr. Speaker, Molly matters.
You see, Mr. Speaker, Cassie made the choice to carry Molly to term. She made the choice to become a mother, and Jeff made the choice to become a father. But Mr. Speaker, that night, that choice was robbed from them.
But while over 70% of Canadians supported the proposed law and what is to many just basic common sense, a majority of Canada's politicians, it seems, had other plans, alleging that assigning any value whatsoever to the life of an unborn child like Molly risked reopening Canada's abortion debate, even though those two issues from a legal perspective are entirely separate questions.
When Cassie and Molly's law was brought forward, it was not the pro-life politicians that made it about abortion. They were actually very clear. This wasn't going to change the legal reality of abortion at all. Anyone who wanted to have an abortion could still go forward and do that, even if this law was passed.
To watch leaders stand up and say, no, we don't want to acknowledge any difference between what is a woman's choice and what a violent, murderous criminal choose for her. We don't want to acknowledge that there's a difference. In Canada, we have the appearance that a woman's choice matters, and Cassie made that choice a long time before.
And in other countries, such as the United States and parts of Australia, this is already the established law, with legislation like the Unborn Victims of Violence Act recognizing the intentional killing of a pregnant woman as two separate offenses. And wherever these laws have been introduced, they have not in any way restricted access to abortion. Despite this, when the votes were counted, Liberal, NDP, Green Bloc, and 3 Conservative MPs joined together to defeat the bill before it even reached committee, by a combined vote of 209 to 76. Devastating Molly's father and Cassie's family, and leaving them disillusioned with Canada's politicians.
It doesn't just become a law if you vote yes. It goes to committees and you discuss the implications and all of these things. They wouldn't even allow that. It's not even that the bill failed, because they didn't vote against a law. What they voted against was a conversation.
It's ironic because these so-called pro-choice politicians that voted against Cassie and Molly's law are only interested in protecting the choice of abortion, because when it came to the choice of Cassie choosing Molly and choosing to give birth to her, they turned a blind eye because it could touch the abortion issue, or so they think.
There are challenges in the conversation, but don't tell me that we can't articulate a difference between when a woman chooses an abortion and when a man kills a pregnant woman. Mm-hmm. That is preposterous.
I actually don't think this is a pro-life or pro-choice question. If you have a woman who is visually pregnant, but you put a bullet to that person or you stab that woman in the stomach, that to me should lead to a sentence enhancement, which is that's a level of evil where I think the question becomes, are you charged with killing 2 people?
While on the surface, the unsuccessful fight for Molly's law and the shock decision by the Quebec Court of Appeal may seem like separate and unrelated issues, in truth, they are both symptoms of the very same disease. of an elite and out-of-touch political and judicial establishment that persistently undervalues human life while putting criminals instead of victims first, and leaving hard-working, law-abiding Canadians like Jeff Durham behind.
This is how important this issue is to Canadians. If you don't have a discussion of what's every life taken worth, well, what in the world is the court there for? To just do tax cases?
To know that, he'll be amongst the free people again. I think about it every single day. Every single day, I think about how can I prepare myself for that.
Cassie was excited to have her, and she was brutally killed. Her child wasn't served justice. And because her child wasn't served justice, Cassie wasn't served justice either.
My name is Aaron Gunn, and this has been Politics Explained.